learning British English can be proper confusing, especially when it comes to pronunciation and accent. So today, I'm going to show you 5 things that you really need to know when it comes to learning British pronunciation. So you're really not going to want to miss this one. All right, mate, and welcome to the BritSpeakPod, the podcast designed to help you understand British life, British culture, and of course, British English. So let's get cracking. Hey up, mate. How's it going today? I'm not too bad. Thanks for asking, and welcome to episode 008 of the BritSpeakPod, where we're going to be talking about British English pronunciation and everything you need to know. But before we get into all that, if you're new around here, nice to meet you. My name is Dan. Do me a favour and please subscribe to this podcast wherever you get your podcast from. I'd appreciate that. And if you're returning, it's not your first time here, welcome back, mate. It's nice to see you again. I hope you had a good week. Anyway, today we're talking all about British pronunciation. It's a difficult topic. I'm sure you guys have struggled with this before. And I'm going to show you some things that you really need to know if you want to develop your British English pronunciation, right? But there are a few things I want to say before we get into the meat of today's episode, yeah? First of all, do as I say, not as I do, right? My accent is a bit of a mess because I grew up in Yorkshire, so I already had a natural Yorkshire accent, which is not a typical British accent, right? It's actually quite hard to understand people from Yorkshire, and probably at some point in the future, I'll make an episode about it. But for now, just understand that I came from a place with a pretty strange accent. And when I became an English teacher, I had to kind of develop a teacher voice because I came to Japan with my thick Yorkshire accent, and I was talking to other teachers from Australia and from South Africa and from America and wherever. And they also couldn't really understand what I was saying. So my students didn't have much chance to understand my natural accent. So I had to develop this kind of teacher voice. And I've been using this teacher voice for 8 years now. So my natural accent is a bit of a mess. So I do things that are not exactly correct. So I would suggest not necessarily copying me word for word, but I'm going to tell you how to develop a British accent, but maybe don't do as I do, just do as I say, is the first thing. The next thing I wanted to explain is that when it comes to British pronunciation, there is no one correct answer, There's a load of different British accents, and they all do things a little bit differently, and that's okay. It's fine that not everybody does the same thing. So I don't want you to take what I'm saying and be like, well, that's wrong because this person does it differently. Great, they do it differently. That's fine. We're both allowed to do things differently, So don't get too hung up on what is British English. I mean, I've done a full episode already talking about there's no such thing as British English. I think it's episode 2, actually, 002, if you want to go back into the archives and you want to check that one out. But the point I'm trying to make is British English is not just one thing. There's lots of variations. There's lots of different ways of doing things. And what I'm going to tell you today won't apply to everything across the board. However, the things I'm going to share with you in this episode do crop up in lots of different British accents. And there are techniques that you will hear all the time. And it's important that if you want to develop a British accent or you want to have more British pronunciation, that you work on these things and you understand them even if you don't use them yourself. That's what I would say. So without further ado then, I want to get into some sounds or some techniques, I guess, that are very important in British English. And I'm going to start with something called the glottal T. Glottalization is the correct word. So you guys have probably seen those memes online, yeah? Where it's like British people always say bottle of water instead of a bottle of water, right? And this is kind of a meme, but it's kind of true. And what is happening here is called glottalization. Now, this happens in a lot of British accents, and it's where the T sound is replaced with like a little pause. And you'll notice in that last sentence, I said British, little, bottle. You know, I'm not saying the T sound in these words. It's kind of just a little pause instead. Now, basically, the way you make this sound is you kind of close your vocal cords and you don't let the air come out. The best way I can describe it is if you say the word uh-oh, like a Teletubby, you know, uh-oh, in between uh-oh, there's that little pause. That is a glottal stop. So, you know, if you want to practice making this sound, you can go uh-oh, uh-oh, and you can kind of stop the air. Another way you can practice this sound is to take a vowel sound. Let's say I, like in sit, the I sound. And you just say that one specific sound over and over again. It. Now, if you slow it down, it, you can hear that little pause, right? That's the glottal stop. That's the sound we're trying to make. Or I guess it's lack of sound that we're trying to make in this case. So what I would say is some British accents will drop the T, and it's very common in words like butter and water and these kind of words. Now, not all British accents do this, and there's a big argument these days in RP, you know, received pronunciation, what everybody thinks is the British accent, because some people do it and some people don't, and there's a bit of an argument about whether it's acceptable or not. Either way, you're definitely going to hear it from British people. Not all British people, but most British people are going to drop the T, and it can be pretty confusing if you're not expecting it. It can be a bit weird when suddenly letters go missing, and you're like, what is water? What's that? Well, it's water. It's the thing you drink from a bottle, you know, that kind of thing. So it's definitely worth spending a bit of time. If I were you, I'd listen to some other podcasts from British speakers, not necessarily English teachers, but maybe you're into footy, maybe you're into gaming, maybe you're into mountain biking, whatever you're into. Maybe you can find a podcast by a British person and you can listen to their natural accent, and you'll start to pick up on this kind of glottalization of the T sound the more you hear it. And if you want to practice it yourself, try and find words with two T's in the middle, you know, butter, water, little, bottle, and practice going water, butter, little, bottle, and just kind of practice like that. And that should get you there. Another thing that British people often do, once again, not everybody, but it's quite common, is called H dropping. Now, this is where the H at the beginning of words kind of disappears, right? Not all the time, not every word beginning with H. But, for example, the word house may be pronounced as house. Like I do. I rarely would say house. It's actually quite hard for me to do that. It's quite hard for me to say house, is what I'm saying. So this can get confusing for people because they expect this H sound, but often it doesn't appear, right? Now, in individual words like house and hotel, you can probably guess what's going on. It's probably not that difficult. However, when it comes down to words like he, him, her, right? It gets a bit tricky. So let's imagine this sentence. He has forgotten his passport. He has forgotten his passport. Now, in English, we often move sounds around, right? So it becomes he has forgotten his passport, right? But listen to how I say it quickly. He's forgotten his passport. He's forgotten his passport. He's forgotten his passport. So the H disappears, but an N shows up. Like, he's forgotten his passport. And it can be a bit tricky to string the words together when certain letters go missing. But once again, this is something that you will hear all the time from us Brits. And if you want to not be confused and you want to actually sound more British, depending on the accent you're choosing to learn, dropping that H might be a good ear. good idea. So you can say things like, the hotel were horrible, and everybody's going to think that you're proper British. Good stuff. The next thing that I wanted to talk to you about today is called TH fronting. This is a fancy term, but basically what this is certain British accents will take the TH sound, like think or this, and they replace it with like an F sound or a V sound or sometimes a D sound. So it gets a bit weird. So instead of think, we end up with think. And instead of this, you sometimes get this or dis, and it can be a bit strange to pick up on these things at first. Now, if I'm going to talk in a proper natural accent for me, I tend to use F instead of TH. I'm thinking about going there next week. I'm thinking about going there. Like it's a bit weird. You can often get these words mixed up, like think and dare. You're not necessarily going to assume is think and there. So it is something you need to be really careful about. Maybe you're not going to do this, and it's not as common as some of the other things on this list, but if you are wanting to master British English, you need to know that this exists. So I think you should spend some time learning this. Okay? Yeah, there we go. Using the sounds in the example. Good work, Dan. Excellent work. As always, with any of these techniques, if you really want to practice, find somebody who speaks in the accent that does it and shadow them and copy them and try and mimic what they're doing. That's a good way to practice. Next up is probably one of the most common sounds that exists in British English that people get wrong. Now, this sound is not exclusive to British English. Americans do it too, just British people do it way more than Americans. And I'm talking about the schwa sound. Now, the schwa sound is often, if you see it written down, it's like an upside down E. Sometimes you'll see that in the dictionary, a little upside down E. And it's a schwa, and this is like a neutral vowel sound. And it's commonly found in the unstressed syllables in words, right? So, best example I can give you is the word banana. There's 3 sounds in banana. The first sound is not stressed, b. Not ba, b. The second sound is stressed, na. We get the strong r sound. And then the third sound is also not stressed, so you get this n sound. Banana. Banana. So in the first and the third sounds, you're not getting the regular vowel sound. It's not banana. I'm not a minion. I'm not wanting one of them weird minion films saying banana. No. In British English, there are schwa sounds. Banana, banana. You'll also hear it in things like London. This sound is what you're aiming for. It's not really a vowel sound. It's just like a neutral noise that we put in unstressed parts of the word, right? If you want to practice this, focus on words with more than one unstressed syllable, if you can. Banana is a good example. Or even just words with 2 syllables, London, sofa, again. It's not always the first sound or the second sound. It depends on the word. But looking at these words and practicing pronouncing the strong syllable with a good vowel sound, like London, London, or banana. Practice the difference between that soft schwa vowel sound and that strong vowel sound in the same word. Now, this goes one step further when it comes to British English, and I'm going to talk about why in a second. But we often use a schwa in British English when a word ends in ER. The R disappears and the E becomes a schwa sound. That's why it's mother, brother, sister, father, these kind of words. It's not father, this schwa sound, yeah? And that's basically because of the schwa, but it's also because of this next point. And the next point is that most British English accents are not rhotic. They're non-rhotic accents. Now, this is a very complicated term, but what we mean when we say non-rhotic is we're talking about the way we pronounce the R sound. And this is a big difference between British and American English, yeah? So in British English, which is non-rhotic for most of them, even RP is usually non-rhotic, the R sound is not pronounced at the end of a word or before a consonant. Okay, so a consonant is a non-vowel sound. So if the R exists at the end of a word, like in the word car, we don't pronounce the R. Americans will strongly pronounce the R. Car, car. British people don't do that. Car, R. It's this longer, drawn out, almost like AH rather than AR. So car, for example, right? We don't pronounce the R at the end of that word because we just don't. It doesn't really work that way. And we'll also not pronounce the R sound when the following sound is also a consonant. You know, surprise, for example. You've got the R and then the P. Because the following sound is a consonant sound, we don't pronounce the R. It's not surprise. Surprise. The R disappears, right? And this is quite common in British English. I think it's quite common in a lot of Australian accents as well. I mean, I'm not an expert about Australian English, but I think they are often non-rhotic as well. So, yeah, be careful with this R sound. And especially if it exists before a consonant or at the end of a word. We only really pronounce it before a vowel. If the next word is a vowel, we will pronounce the R. Sorry, the next letter in the word is a vowel, we'll pronounce the R. But if it's not, we won't. We just skip it and make it a longer vowel sound. And that can be confusing for a lot of people as well, but not for you, because now you know what you need to do if you want to learn British pronunciation. And of course, if you are interested in improving your British pronunciation, you can work with me. We can work on pronunciation techniques and practice in private lessons. If you're interested, you can go to the link in the show notes, or you can go to my website, which is britspeak.co/services, and you can see all the different options, and you can work with me to improve your British English pronunciation. And even though I speak in a weird kind of mishmash of accents, I do know how to actually correctly teach pronunciation, and even accents that I can't speak, I can help you with. So be sure to check that out. And as always, I'd really appreciate it if you enjoyed this episode, if you can check out other episodes in the archives at britspeak.co/podcasts, or just subscribe to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts from, because that way you're never going to miss an episode and you can keep going on your journey to become a confident communicator in English. But for today, that's everything I've got for you. In the next episode, we're going to be talking all about school life in the UK, a bit of a change of pace. We're going to be talking about the school system in England, because it's that time of year when all the kids are going back to school, and maybe you're interested to learn about how that's going to work. But that's it for this episode, and I'll catch you in the next one. See you there.